Good morning, church family. What a great song to introduce a Sunday talking about stewardship, because without living hope, none of this really matters, right? What a good reminder. Well, my name is Caleb Dragna. I'm the student ministry director here, and it is our third week and our last week of our series, Stewardship and You. So some of you might be really sad about that like me, and others of you might be like, good, get that guy out of here. We've heard enough. But either way, this is the last week of talking about stewardship and you in our series. And so the last 2 weeks we've spent talking about what it means to be a steward. And so that means that you own nothing yourself, but that you are given resources from the master, and that you are called to treat those resources and to use them as the master would on his behalf. And he's entrusted those resources to each of us. We took some time to talk about stewarding our time and how we should be using it to serve God, to serve others, and to do so together in community. And then I used some of my God-given talents last week to demonstrate to us that God has called each of us to use our talents and gifts and abilities to faithfully serve him. And this week we're going to conclude our series by taking a look at one final resource that God has entrusted to all of us, and that is your treasure. Probably the thing that comes to most of our minds first when we think of what being a steward is about, and that's treasure or money. But before we get into our passage this morning, I want you to close your eyes for just a second, and I want you to picture the first person, the very first person who comes to mind when I say this name, okay? So here we go. Bernie. All right, everyone has a picture in their mind. All right, open your eyes, and I'm going to try to guess. Some of you probably thought of this guy, right? Bernie Sanders? A lot of people probably thought of him. He's a very popular political figure, but he became a meme a few years ago when he was not so happy in the middle of winter. And others of you might have thought of a great movie from a while back, Weekend at Bernie's. Anybody think of that one? Yeah, so another guy named Bernie. Well, for myself, as someone who studied finance and accounting and all those kind of things, the first person that comes to my mind when I think of the name Bernie is actually Bernie Madoff. And so he was responsible for possibly the most brilliant, but also the most costly financial fraud ever committed. One could argue that he might be the main reason why many business colleges today have to teach a class on business ethics in the first place. One that I took, I promise. But Bernie created a decade-long complex Ponzi scheme that defrauded many people, even some of his closest friends, of millions upon millions of dollars. He was really smart, something of a genius, really, but he was also a liar and a fraudster and a cheat. And people placed their faith in his financial knowledge and ability, and they invested lots and lots of money with him, hoping to churn huge profits for themselves. But in the end, he used their money to fund his own lavish lifestyle. And many of these investors quite literally lost everything they had as a result of his dishonesty. And yet, in today's parable, we're going to look at another dishonest manager. But this time, it's used as a positive example for Christ followers and how we should use our money. And so to avoid being dishonest from the get-go myself with you this morning, I just want to tell you that this is perhaps one of the most difficult parables in the entire Bible to understand. It could easily be misunderstood, it could accidentally be mishandled, or it could even intentionally be misused. And so we're going to take our time with it this morning, walking through it. And I'm going to present to you the interpretation of these events that I find to be most likely, while also recognizing that there are other possibilities. And so at times I will even point out to you the other possibilities, but I think that you'll find that whatever school of interpretation you find yourself adhering to, regardless, the message of the parable remains the same. The major point is exactly the same. And it gives us very clear instructions of how we are to steward our treasure and put our money to use for God's glory. And so without further ado, if you don't know any idea what parable I'm talking about, turn to Luke chapter 16, beginning in the very first verse, and it's usually titled the parable of the dishonest manager, or some Bibles will generously title it the parable of the shrewd manager. And we'll talk about that. And so beginning in verse 1, this is Jesus speaking. It says, "He also said to the disciples, 'There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions.'" And so we see Jesus is addressing his disciples, but this is more than just the 12 disciples, most likely. It's more than the 12 apostles. This is a larger gathering of disciples. And so by extension, it also clearly includes those of us who would call ourselves Christ's disciples today. And so Luke introduces this section of Scripture with the words, or Jesus does, "There was a rich man." And this is a very, very typical opening to a parable in Luke. If you go just a few verses later in chapter 16, you'll find the story of the rich man and Lazarus, and it begins with the same opening. There was a rich man. And so Luke introduces a lot of parables this way. So that kind of keys us into the fact that we're about to hear a parable. And so in this parable, we get a rich man who is probably, most likely, a landowner who owns lots of land. And how do I know that he was a landowner? Well, as we're going to see, the debts that he is owed that make him rich are debts of crops that people have promised to pay him. And so a typical arrangement back then was that someone would own a vast amount of land, and they would basically contract out people to come in and cultivate the crops on that land. And those men would then cultivate the crops, grow and take care and tend to the crops, and then they would sell them in the market, but they would pay the landowner essentially a rent payment to use the land for that. And so as you can imagine, if you own a lot of land and you have a lot of crops and a lot of people operating on your land, that can get complicated, especially if you don't just own one parcel of land, but you own some land here and some land there and over there, and you also have lots of other business endeavors going on because after all, you're a rich man. And so that would be a lot for one person to handle. And so often, as we see here, what would happen is they would employ a manager. Another way to think about this manager, though, is to think of him as a steward, because he's acting like the master would with the things that he has entrusted. But in this case, it comes to this rich man's attention that his steward is wasting his possessions. And this wasting that we see here is the same kind of wasting that had just been talked about in Luke chapter 15, when we get the parable of the prodigal son and how he squandered his inheritance. It's the same kind of idea here. And so I want to highlight something, though. In this wasting that is occurring, the manager is not yet being dishonest, right? The charges that are brought against him are not indicative of fraud. These are rather an open and honest misuse of resources. And so that will prove important as we go through this parable, because some people see this is where he's dishonest and then they see a change of heart, but that's not the case. It's not the case. And so this manager, though, has forgotten his role as a steward. He's been treating the master's resources entirely like they're his own. He's been doing what he wants to with them rather than what the master would have him do, to the point where other people have even taken notice of that and gone to his master and said, hey, this guy's wasting your possessions. And so, dishonest? No. Foolish? Yes. Clearly. But before we're so quick to judge this manager, we have to reflect and ask ourselves, do we ever treat the resources that God has entrusted to us in this way? Do we ever serve ourselves before we serve him with his resources? Do we ever receive money or anything really and immediately find ways to use it on ourselves and our own interests without consulting him ever, but more importantly, consulting him first? Right? We read in Matthew 6:33 to seek first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. We should go to him first. But we keep going in our parable. In verse 2 it says, this is the landowner speaking, and he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And so there's something very important that's implied in this verse between verse 1 and 2. Namely, that the charges that were brought against the steward to the master are true. Right? Because here he's acting as though they're true. They've proven to be true. And another reason why I don't think the manager has yet been dishonest is because, as we're going to see, he doesn't refute these charges. He doesn't argue that this isn't true. And so he's not yet been dishonest. But he does confirm his guilt by not refuting these charges. But so this manager is called to give essentially his final account to the master, and he's subsequently going to be let go. Right? It's kind of like the master is saying, all right, I'll give you some time to get caught up on your work, but as soon as you're caught up, go ahead and close the books, hand them to me, and your services will no longer be needed here. I'll take it from here. Right? And so this manager's got quite a situation on his hands. So what's he going to do? Well, we read. Verses 3 and 4, it says, and the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. And so for the first time, we get the words from the manager, and he realizes the gravity of his situation. And if you've ever had a difficult conversation with your boss at work, you kind of understand what he's going through, and you understand this kind of self-reflection that happens when you're encountered with those circumstances. And so he begins to think about his future. And he comes to the realization that he's got two problems. One is a physical problem. He's not strong enough to do manual labor, to dig. The second is a psychological problem. He's ashamed to beg. He's apparently not a fan of the temptations, right? He's too proud to beg. They had a song literally called Ain't Too Proud to Beg. Maybe that's too old. It's a classic. But perhaps for the very first time, this manager has realized by proving not to be a faithful steward of his master's resources, he has quite literally put his future in jeopardy. And I want us to appreciate verse 4. It loses a little bit of the abruptness in the English language. Because quite literally what happens is he's reflecting and saying, I don't know what I'm going to do, I don't know what I'm going to do, and then ding, light bulb, aha, great Scott, that's brilliant. That's what comes to him. He's got this great idea. And he has this ingenious plan of how he's going to preserve his future. And so we don't get an idea of what that is just yet, but we see him in the next verses begin to carry out that plan. And so we read verses 5 through 7. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. And so we see him carrying out this brilliant plan that he's concocted in the previous verse. He's going to lower the bills of his master's debtors so that they will find him to be generous. And they will in turn be generous to him when he has officially lost his job. But there's a few things we need to highlight here, because doesn't that feel a little bit uncomfortable for some of us that he's just deciding to do this to lower their bills? We get keyed into the fact that it's not maybe a super good idea, because he tells the first debtor, sit down quickly, right? And why would he do that? Well, two main reasons. One, we said that this is a pretty large parcel of land, so there's probably a lot of debtors that he has to meet with. He's got a limited window of time, and it says he met with them one by one. And so he's got a lot of meetings to have and a little time to have them, right? The second thing, and maybe the more obvious thing, is he doesn't want to get caught, right? He's like, let's do this quickly. You sit down, scratch out 100, and write 50 real fast. No one will know the difference, right? Because if he gets caught doing this by the master, well, if I was the master, I'd probably say, all right, pal, I was going to give you a week, but go ahead and give me that book you got with the account, and you're good to go. I got it from here, right? He entirely loses any ability to further preserve his future if he gets caught in the middle of this. But the manager instructs the debtors to lower their bills significantly, right? One by 50%, another one by 20%. And I want to this is where I'm going to tell you there's some differences that exist as to what exactly is going on here. The first one, the first possibility, is that he's merely cutting into his own share of the profits, right? Because as the steward, what would typically happen was you would be in charge of managing and collecting the debt. You would then get a certain percentage for yourself, and then you would pass on the remainder of the profits to the master. That was kind of like your cut of the deal, your commission. And so some people have said, well, the manager's probably just cutting into his own commission, right? He's just being generous. But that's not what's happening. Because after all, what's really going on is he would be giving up the money that he needs, right? Like he's literally cutting into his own pockets and money that he would need to stay on his feet until he could get another job. And so I don't think that's what's going on. And there's another reason why I don't think that's what's going on. That doesn't feel dishonest to me, right? If he's cutting into his own commissions, that's his choice. He can do that. He can choose to do that. It's not dishonest. And so later on, he's going to be referred to as dishonest. Very, very clearly referred to as dishonest. So I don't think that's what's going on. Others have seen this move as him knocking down interest off of the debt. And why would he do that? Well, another typical thing, you and I, we probably don't have a great knowledge of Jewish law, so I'm going to give you a Jewish law lesson this morning. Here we go. So, typical arrangement was, landowner can't charge interest to his tenants, right? Because Jewish law said a Jew could not charge another Jew interest on a debt. And so how would they then collect extra? Well, they would hide the debt within the principal that they owed. They would just jack the debt way up, and the interest would kind of be hidden in the contract there. That was very typical. And so some have said, well, this manager is just tacking off that illegal debt. And in that way, he's actually giving his master a better reputation. He actually looks better in this thing. But just like you and I don't know that Jewish law off the top of our heads, remember that Luke wrote primarily to a non-Jewish audience, right? And so he would probably have to put those details in there if that's what's going on, because they wouldn't know that either. And so for that reason, I don't think that's what's going on. And so what does that leave us with? What's the only other possibility? Well, the other possibility is that this manager is strictly being dishonest. He is literally cutting away from his master's profits in order to benefit himself and make himself look good. And so it's kind of brilliant, right? Because on the one hand, the master is like, hey, you're cutting into my profits. But on the other hand, the debtors are like, that's a master I want to keep working for if he's going to just lower my bill like that, right? So it's brilliant. It's brilliant. But it's dishonest. It is dishonest. So what he's doing is he's literally lowering the debts that they owe. Their debts are going to be forgiven for much less than they owed. And in that way, they will then owe him a favor. He's doing himself a big favor, but he's lying. And so we would expect the master to have a pretty harsh reaction to that, right? If someone cuts your end of the profits off to make themselves look good and you really don't have any way to go after them for that without looking like a jerk, really. So you'd think he'd be pretty upset, but then what do we read in the first half of verse 8? It says the master commended the dishonest manager. Why? For his shrewdness. The master praises the dishonest manager. Like, why? What gives? Well, notice here what is commended. It's not the manager's actions. It's not the outcomes of his actions, but it is his shrewdness. And a lot of times when we hear that word in today's language, when we hear someone is being shrewd, we tend to think of that negatively. We think maybe they're being a little sketchy. Yeah, they're smart, but they're misusing their smarts to benefit themselves, right? That's not how this word is used here. The shrewdness here, to be shrewd, is to have understanding resulting from insight and wisdom. That's very important for us to remember, so I'm going to repeat it. To be shrewd in the Bible, in this case, is to have understanding which has resulted from insight and wisdom. As we seek God's will by studying His Word, spending time with Him in prayer, spending time with other believers who should be sharpening us, we can also grow and we should be seeking to become righteously shrewd. And so if we stopped right here, we might think this was really confusing. I agree, it's confusing if you stop right here. Thankfully, Jesus knew that. He doesn't always explain His parables, but in this case, He gives us quite an explanation. And that's actually the transition that happens here. In the middle of verse 8, it goes from parable story to now Jesus commentary. And let me tell you, I read a lot of commentaries. I want Jesus commentary on the whole Bible. I wish that existed. That would be amazing. But it does for this parable. So beginning in the second half of verse 8, it says, this is Jesus speaking, "For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." And so we have this explanation from Jesus here. And he says in the second half of verse 8 that the sons of this world are more shrewd, meaning they are more wise, they are more forward-thinking, they are more self-preservation minded in matters that are temporary. That's what it means when it says with their own generation, with things that will pass away within a generation. They are wiser with things of that temporary nature than his own followers often are regarding matters of eternal significance that will last forever. I pray that that not prove to be true of us today. We should go to God for insight. We should be doing everything we possibly can to grow in godly wisdom. And we should be operating in our today, in the present, while keeping an eye towards the impact on our eternal future. And that is the mindset that we have to approach verse 9 with. Because otherwise, it seems confusing. Because Jesus says, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. And so when we read that unrighteous wealth, does that mean, we just talked about a dishonest manager, does that mean this wealth was earned in a dishonest way? No. Does it mean money? You might be like, well, I get it. Money's evil, right? Unrighteous. Does it mean money is inherently evil? No. No. It merely points out that money in itself is not able to be righteous. And so by virtue of not being righteous, it must then be unrighteous. And this unrighteous wealth is talking about earthly riches, earthly money. But this money is neutral when it comes to being good or evil. It is up to those who have it and how they use it that determines whether money is indeed good or evil. And you say, whoa, hold on a second. There's a verse that says money's evil. I know it's out there. Maybe you even know it off the top of your head. I'm going to challenge you right now to read it word for word. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It's not the money, it's the unrighteous love of money. Money often brings out the worst in people, but it's not the money's fault. It's the unrighteous love of money that is evil. And then we get to something else curious in these verses. Jesus says to use that unrighteous wealth to do what? To make friends, to earn friends. So you might be saying, well then do we buy our friends' affections and loyalties with our money? No, not exactly. This verse is not saying to spend money on your friends so that later you can lord it over them and be like, hey, you owe me one. Remember when I spent that money on you? That's not what this verse is talking about. What this verse is telling us is that to make proper use of money, you have to adopt an eternal mindset. Right? Using money or anything else that God has entrusted to us in order to win others for the kingdom is what is being described here. That's what it talks about when it says, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. There are two primary things that they is referring to. The first one, obviously we know, God is in heaven, right? He will welcome us into eternal dwellings. And you say, well then why doesn't it say, he may receive you? Well, remember, God is 3 in 1, the Trinity. He is plural, so he can be referred to with the plural, they. But there's another group that this includes. It also includes people who have been affected by how you have made generous use of your money and your other resources in such a way that you actually played a role in winning them to Jesus. And they have preceded you into heaven. And when you finally get there, they are so excited to welcome you there and to celebrate you. That's what this is talking about. And notice that this verse ends with saying when this unrighteous wealth fails, not if it fails. Because worldly possessions do not last forever. No matter how hard you try, you cannot take them with you. And Jesus continues. He continues for a few more verses. Each of these verses, I want to point out before we read them, they have a contrasting parallel. Two things that are held side by side and compared to one another by way of contrast. Okay, so verse 10, it says, one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. And so this is Jesus speaking again. He's giving us further clarity about this parable through his sayings here. And it's teaching us what how he expects his disciples to treat their money. And so this first contrast we have is faithful versus dishonest. And it makes a little bit of sense to us, right? When you read it, when you are able to be entrusted with a little, then you earn the right to be entrusted with more. But didn't we just talk about a dishonest guy and he was a good example? And Jesus is rebuking dishonesty right here. That's a little confusing, isn't it? Well, remember that what was praised by the master about the manager was not his dishonesty, it was his shrewdness. We keep going. Verse 11 and 12. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust to you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? So here we have unrighteous wealth, true riches. And we've already talked about unrighteous wealth, right? That's earthly, temporal riches. And so God says, if I can't trust you with temporary things that are not going to last forever, how could I ever trust you with the weight of something eternal? The true riches. And then in verse 12, that one might feel backwards. Anybody feel like that's backwards? Okay, well you guys are good Bible theologians out there, but in our common sense minds it feels backwards. Because what we think in our common sense mind is, if I prove to be responsible with my own things, then other people can trust me with their things. Right? That's probably how we would expect that to read, but it's the opposite. If you can't be trusted with what is another's, who will give you that which is your own? And that's why it's so important to understand the idea of being entrusted. Because God has entrusted you with things. But if you can't be faithful with what he has entrusted to you, how could he ever give you anything that you have more control over? If you cannot be a faithful steward of the time, talent, and treasure that he has entrusted to you, how could he ever trust you with excess in any of those areas? If he can't trust you to be a wise and generous investor when you only have a little bit to work with, how could he ever trust you with more and more? That's what this verse is saying. And that is why it closes out this section with verse 13. No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. This is the last of our contrasting parallels, right? We have God and money. Notice that this verse does not say you should not serve God and money. No. It points out the sheer impossibility of ever doing so. Just as certainly as you cannot move right and left at the same time, you cannot serve God and money. You will find yourself in one of these two positions this morning. You either serve God, you love God, and you want to do with your money what he wants you to do with it because you love him and you serve him, and that is what you are pursuing. Or you are fully underneath the authority of your money. That's what you're chasing. That's what you're going after. That's what you care about and value and love. And in doing so, you have put God underneath you. You're saying, I know better than you, God, what to do with this money. I'll give you everything else, but I don't need your help with this one. I got it. That is where there's only those two positions. There's no third option. There's no third option. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves today is, how can I properly steward my treasure? It's a hard question, but it has a fairly simple answer. Invest your treasure wisely. And you might be sitting out there and saying, wow, I sat through 27 minutes for that? Yes, you did. No, it's simple, right? It's an easy to remember, simple answer to this question. But there are two aspects of it that I want to talk through. Invest your treasure wisely. And so how do you become an investor and how do you do that wisely? Let's talk about that. I'm going to give you 3 statements to form a full answer to this question based on what we looked at together this morning. The first step, if you're like, I don't know what to do first, evaluate your spiritual health, then your financial health. Because if your spiritual health is not in order, your financial health won't be either. That's just a hard truth. But only you know the true relationship you have with God and the money that he has entrusted you with. And so maybe this morning you're like, I don't know how to change. I don't know where to make a change. Well, let me give you some helpful self-reflection questions. The first one is this. Am I asking God first what I should do with the money he has already blessed me with? If you're not, that's the first thing you have to do. Start asking him first. The next question you could ask yourself is, what's the first thing I look to spend any unanticipated income on? And if you're like me and you're like, unanticipated income, what is that? Then you can ask yourself this, what do I find myself dreaming about doing if I had more money? If I had more, what would I use it for? And I want to tell you something, and I want to pay attention here. God might trust you with an abundance one day. He might. But it's not so that you can have a better living. It's so that you can have better giving. So are your decisions that you're making right now, are they based on pursuing a better living, or are they based on pursuing better giving? After you've done that self-evaluation and you decided, you know what, I want to be an investor today, then you have to decide to do so generously. You have to give generously in ways that advance the gospel. Have you ever heard the expression, you can't outgive God? I'm sure we've all heard that at one time or another. Many who preach the prosperity gospel, which is really a false gospel, it's not the gospel at all, they will tell you that as you give more to God, it's really to them, but that's for another sermon, as you give more to God, he will pour out his blessings on you. And they say, as you continue to give more and more, he will continue to bless you more and more. What a sick and twisted idea that is. That's sick. You know why? Because God is not our personal blessings vending machine. God's favor cannot be earned. He cannot be bought. He is not moved by our efforts at all. But But that expression is absolutely true. You can't outgive God, not because of what he will give you, but because of what he has already given you. He has given you the opportunity to have eternal life. He has given you the free gift of salvation made available by the work of his Son, who left his heavenly dwelling place to come down and dwell among us as one of us. He fulfilled the law by living a perfect life, but he suffered the brutal death of a sinner at the cross. He gave his literal blood, sweat, and tears to erase the dark stain of sin for all of us, and instead, he has given us his bright, white, glowing righteousness in return. He died. He rose again, conquering both sin and grave, and he is alive to this day, reigning at the right hand of the Father in heaven. He will come again in glory as a triumphant king and a righteous judge, and every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that he is Lord, and every one of us will give an account of how we used what he entrusted to us to advance his kingdom in this world. We should be using our money to further the spread of the gospel because of the surpassing grace that God has extravagantly lavished on every single one of us. Our giving is not to earn anything, no. It is in direct response to the overwhelming value of the gospel for all who believe. No amount of anything I could ever give to God could ever compare to that. And so you might be saying, well, how can I do that? How can I do that? Well, I'm going to give you just a few suggestions. This is not an exhaustive list, but here's just a few. That can be done by supporting this church. Our church exists for two reasons. One, we want to see everyone reached with the good news of the gospel from here to the ends of the earth. The second reason that our church exists is to fulfill the needs of God's people, both their practical needs and their need for ministry in their lives, in all of our lives. And all of the ministry that we do here is centered around declaring the gospel. That can also be done by supporting short-term mission trips that go and bring the gospel around the world. It can be done by supporting missionaries around the world directly. That can be done by supporting other organizations that do gospel-centered outreach, both here locally and globally. That can also be done by you using your money to literally meet the needs of people in your life generously and pointing them to Jesus. However you do it, just do it. And you might be sitting here this morning and say, well, I faithfully give my 10% every week or every paycheck. That's good. Keep doing that. But know this. In the New Testament, after Jesus, God does not command us to tithe 10% anymore. After the time of Jesus, we have an even greater obligation than that. We are called to sow bountifully, to be generous, and to be cheerful about it. We read in 2 Corinthians 9, verses 6 and 7, the point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And if you keep reading in that passage, I'm not going to read it now because of time, but you see that God is our provider. He will enrich you. Why? So that you can be generous. And what happens? Your generosity will result in thanksgiving to God. How? Not only does it supply the needs of God's people who will thank God, which is one of those major reasons why you support this church. Right? We use what we are given wisely to meet those needs. That's what makes us a church family more than just a church, people who do church together. We are a church family. And others will see the way that our church family loves and takes care of one another. And they will see your generosity, and they will be curious, and you will be able to tell them that you're not just a good person. You do it because of what God has given to you. And when they hear that, they want to be a part of it too. And then they will give thanks to God because they will be so thankful that he used you to teach them that truth. And then they will want to be a part of what you're doing. And then they will want to be generous. It is an amazing cycle that generosity creates. But cheerful giving and abundant generosity can only happen when you recognize God as the source of your treasure, and also that your treasure is but a mere blip in light of eternity. And that can only happen when you live with an eternal mindset. That's the whole point of the parable today. The manager was shrewd and wise because he was forward-thinking, because he made decisions and took actions in his present that preserved his future, decisions that made an impact far beyond the immediate results. You and I have the opportunity to make the investment of a lifetime every single day. This investment has guaranteed returns. It pays dividends into eternity. It's a no-brainer. We can use our money today in ways that impact our eternal future and the eternal futures of many around us. We can all agree that our money is not meant to be wasted. I would argue our money is not even meant to be spent. It is meant to be invested. Our money should be used to accomplish things for the gospel that will far outlast any of us. It should be used to build a wise and generous gospel-proclaiming legacy. So let's all endeavor to be shrewd. Let's be generous. Let's be excellent stewards. And to close this entire series out, I just want to summarize one truth that applies to every resource God has called us to be stewards of. If you prove to be a compassionate, faithful, wise, and eternally minded steward of God's resources, He will continue to entrust you with greater things. What are those greater things? Well, these greater things that God entrusts us with are increased opportunities and responsibilities with matters of eternal significance, and even more than that, He gives us heavenly rewards that He will one day bestow on each of us as we get there. Let's pray. God, we just thank You that You are a generous God, that Your grace is all sufficient. You have given us more than we could ever ask of You already. God, we thank You that You have entrusted us with things like money, that You have entrusted it to us to put to use advancing Your kingdom in this world. And I pray that You would help us as we try to determine what the best way to steward our money and all of our resources is in light of the gospel. We thank You for the generous gift of Jesus that You have given to each of us. Without Him, none of this matters. And so we ask that You would just guide each of us in how we are to use all of the resources You have given us for Your glory. We thank You for Jesus, and it's in His name we pray. Amen.